Hey, good morning. Hey, C4SO. I am Father Jin Cho with the Revelation 79 Task Force for Diversity. I think our name is actually longer than that, but during these Heritage Months, we like to feature a member of C4SO, somebody who is newer than us that people might not be familiar with, so that we can introduce them to their stories and their perspectives. And I had the wonderful privilege this past year of getting to know Min Choi, who is, unfortunately, we share a very similar naming. So we've already been joking that people are going to get our names mixed
Oh,
up. We'll see how that happens, how that goes. But Min, tell me a little bit about yourself, where you are. Tell me a little bit about your family and what you do for our diocese.
yeah. Well, thanks so much, Father Jen, for having me. Yeah, my name is Soo Choi. I'm Korean. It's a very Korean name, I think. And yeah, I currently live in near Portland, Oregon, south of Portland, Oregon, in a little town called Newberg. I attend Church of the Vine, which is a C4SO church with Father Flannery, and I am married to Sarah, and I have three young, energetic kids: Isaac, Nora, and Theo. And so,
How old
yeah,
are they?
uh, they're they're almost 8, 4, and 2, and so we are a lively household right now.
So you got a lot going on. Yeah, that's a
Yeah,
fun age, but energetic is a nice way of putting it.
yeah, that's
Yeah. So, so you have one of my favorite titles, and Anglicans are all about titles. We do
sure.
like lots of interesting titles that people outside of the Anglican world do
Yeah,
not understand. You don't have a particularly Anglican title, but your title is nevertheless cool.
yeah,
It's media architect.
yeah. That
So, what does that mean? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm also learning what that means. It's a title that was kind of created as I shared interest in joining C4SO and the communications team with Andrea and Eric and Bliss. And the original role, so let me just tell you a quick story. The original role was just a social media manager. And despite me hating like any titles with social media in it, I reached out and was interested because I was thinking about ministry and technology, which is connected to what I was studying at the time, and since I've graduated. But as I was conversing with Andrea about my passions, my calling, it was very clear, it was very apparent that it's not just social media that I'm interested in. I'm not here to just manage accounts and like post things. I really have a deep desire to think about theology as well as culture, in the intersection of technology and especially digital media. And so we came up with this title of media architect, and it's not something that I invented. It's something that was kind of like proposed with Andrea and Bishop Todd, and it basically is um, is the idea. I think that the position, as I'm learning, is just really being thoughtful and being hospitable and doing ministry through our structures of communication, and that's why it's like a media architect role where we think about not only what we communicate, but how we communicate and what mediums we communicate through.
Mhm.
And as we build those up, that creates culture, that creates our ability to tell the story of the gospel, to tell C4SO's story. And so I think that's what a media architect within the context of C4SO is all about.
So, telling our stories in the new digital age,
Yeah,
with the different venues and the forums that are available to us with the internet and
absolutely.
smartphone, all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, in a lot of ways over the last 15 years, there's been like a lot of debate about how the church should think about technology and how the church should really disciple and teach about technology use. And I think that's been an incredibly important discussion to overall how we connect in culture. And so
Hmm.
it's sort of what I get passionate about a lot. So yeah.
Yeah. So I am still going to complain about my title or whatever lack thereof there is, because I like that. I'm especially jealous that they came up with it. But this, you're talking about this partly because I know this, because this is your passion. This is sort
Yeah,
of your calling. You, in fact, you did your doctorate of ministry on this. So
that's right.
tell me a little bit more about that, where you did it, how
Yeah,
you did it, and how this connects, because this is like a thing for you.
absolutely, absolutely. So in like 3 years ago in 2019, late 2019, I wanted to um, go after my doctor of ministry, and there was a program at Portland Seminary which I ultimately enrolled in, that focused on semiotics, church, and culture. With
Semiotics.
semiotics,
So
right?
so uh, I don't often use semiotics in my sermons and
Mhm.
my writings. So explain that a little bit more. So what do you mean semiotics, church, and culture? That's a lot right there.
Right, right, right. Well, semiotics at its like most basic disciplinary definition is the study of signs. Semeion is the Greek word for signs. And Christian semiotics is really about understanding how the um, different artifacts of culture inform us, shape us. And I think what a semiotician really does, and it's actually traced biblically back to the tribe of Issachar. So if you study I believe it's Second Chronicles, we might have to cut this part out because I'm forgetting the reference.
Oh,
But
we're definitely gonna keep this in.
totally, that's fine. I don't mind embarrassing myself. But there's an Old Testament reference to the tribe of Issachar being the people who understand the sign of the times, and that
Mm,
informs the um, um, entire kingdom of Israel about what is God doing in the world, how is God moving, how is God changing things in culture, and so yeah, semiotics is all about understanding sort of the subterranean messaging that happens through everything that we look at. And now that we live in a media saturated era or times, we have to be really, really diligent in understanding what culture is saying and how the
mm.
church can respond to that and engage in that. And just a couple weeks ago, in our liturgical calendar, we read from Acts 17, right, where Paul goes to Athens, and so that passage really exemplifies in the New Testament the semiotics of the gospel of
Mm.
Paul entering into the Areopagus and willing to engage with the pagans, with the elites, with the leaders of that city, and at the end persuading some to put their faith into Christ. I think that's what semiotics is really all about.
That's a powerful statement. And this is associated a little bit with the other book that we're reading together. Um, but one of the things that we talked about was that how to read what God is doing in the context of culture,
Yeah.
right? So, like Paul goes into this pagan culture and
Mhm.
he reads God in it in such a way that people there can now understand it and receive him instead of being uh, scared or offended by their culture or the foreignness of their culture, or saying that this is not um, this is not what God really is. All those he says none of those things, but instead reads the signs.
Yeah. I mean, in that text, I think it's a beautiful lesson where at the beginning, Paul is provoked. It's what it says. The author says that Paul is provoked by all the idols, and it
Mm,
moves him to engage rather than condemn or judge or fear. And
that's super
I
cool.
think that's the heart that we should embody more when there's more voices in the arena, when there's more voices in the room. We shouldn't fear that. We have a gospel that can contend, that can
Mm,
compete, that can shine light into all the confusion, all of the dissonance that we experience as people living in in a social media age.
mm.
And so that's what inspires me and gives me hope that we can actually move towards it and not be afraid of it, for sure. Yeah.
That's so in terms of ministry, in terms of what it means to be the church during these times,
Mhm.
semiotics, what you're talking about is to have this deep confidence in and of Christ, that you are able to engage and encounter the times to see what God is doing there before us, to point those things out really for the sake of the kingdom, to do mission work in that sense, to read the culture and to read how God has already engaged with that culture.
That's right. Yeah. I think it is a faithful acknowledgement that God is the kingdom of God is in the midst of our culture and working, and God and the Spirit of God is moving and working and orchestrating, and to be a witness and to be a watchman of that is, like, I think, a really important role or identity that we should embody. Yeah.
So I think I saw a little bit of your DMin work, and it was presented as a video format. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
I make
and
videos.
it wasn't just like a, like iPhone video, a selfie of yourself walking around, but it was actual video. Describe that a little bit. Describe your project a little bit,
Totally.
because I think
Well,
that's interesting.
yeah, let me talk about two things. First of all, when I went to seminary in Chicago in at the start of 2010, that's when social media started to just start gaining traction in our communities and, like, just in culture. And so I had a really unique experience of, like, having to navigate, like, my theological education with this, like, new social novelty that we're all kind of getting immersed into. And I've been a photographer and videographer for 20 years now. I've always been interested in it. It's my favorite tool. It's one of my favorite technologies. This idea that we can capture a moment in time and then share it later and share it with other people. I think that's deeply theological, deeply gospel centered. Really, this idea of documenting and telling our stories. And so that's where initially, like, my interest in, like, what how can we use this tool well. But I noticed that in the first decade, the church has predominantly responded with strategies of modesty, or even just like, hey, that's like counter to how we can be effective in ministry. And so I always felt a little bit like I'm not sure if I buy into that fully. I do understand that there's dangers and concerns, but I do think that if we can sort of understand this tool and use it in the right,
Mm,
appropriate ways, it can actually create just more connection, more
mm,
incarnational ministry. And
mm,
so that really, there's a thread that ultimately I carried into my doctoral work, which is the project was called The Inevitable Church. And the whole point of the project was, how do we be faithful today as a church so that we can ultimately bridge and connect to the future church? So that's why it's
mm,
called The Inevitable Church. It's this idea of, like, how do we start imagining and being curious about how God is working in and outside of the church to form an expression of the church that's coming in the near future, and using all of this technology that is appearing before us, AI, things like that. And I just had this like imagination that the church is going to look very differently just on the outside, just, you know, from a surface level 100 years from now, just like how our church looks completely different than 100 years ago and 200 years ago. There's form difference, not substance difference, but there's form difference. And so yeah, like I got into writing and producing and editing and directing and all these things, and I'm realizing it's a whole universe in itself. But one of the hopes is, I think this is something that anyone can do as technology becomes more ubiquitous and more democratized. You know, your phone now can do the whole step from beginning to end, and you can be thoughtful and skillful in telling your story and engaging culture with the gospel, and sort of doing what Paul did at the Areopagus, because we sort of live in one giant, you know, arena of thought now. And then ultimately, even beyond individualistic ideas, as a church, how do we create hospitality and have a digital front door for people to come in? So those are the things that I talk about in my dissertation.
Yeah. Wow. There, you do. We glimpse just a tiny bit of what you have been passionate about and doing, and have been doing in your work with our diocese. But that's super neat. Having younger, I have kids that are in high school now, and I just know that their world is completely different from the way I grew up. As much as I like to keep up and do all of that stuff to try to, you know, stay hip with the kids, all that, all of that. I mean, I just know that the influence, the way they take in media, the way they think about media, the language of what influences them, what conveys truth to them, is the way in which that happens is very different from when I grew up. You know, I could scream my head off and tell them read a book, but it's just not going to be the same experience. And sometimes I'll read a book, and you know, I'm glad that they know how to read a little bit, but you know, still their world is different. And I think that's what you're saying. For me, how do we engage? This is the next generation. This is our world. Now, I would love to kind of take you back a little bit, because as you're talking about the future, you've also connected with a tradition, the Anglican world, that loves to go to say that we're doing ancient things, that we want to, that there's a connection to ages old liturgies. What is the connection for you there, and how do you make that connection? Because clearly there's something there that happened to you in making that entry into the Anglican world.
Absolutely. I think there is, as a follower of Jesus, there is a call to a paradoxical commitment to going all the way back to the beginning, right? And then also thinking about how God is unfolding history into the future. And I think, you know, being a good Anglican, I think, you know, via media comes to mind of like, hey, we have to do both well. We have to know where we come from, because the story has come to us not instantly. It's come through centuries of, you know, swapping hands and swapping into different cultures, and then ultimately coming to me and this generation. And I think that's the perception that I ultimately have to continually talk about, which is I'm all about the novel. I'm all about progress and what's new and stuff like that, but it comes from a deeply honoring place of like where it all started, and it all kind of like threads together that way. What I see is that the gospel is resilient and stays true, but it takes many forms as it moves, as it moves, the center of it moves from point to point in history. And so when I think about why I deeply love Anglican tradition, is that I think it is so committed to doing that without falling into this singular mindset of only tradition, like only defining tradition in this very narrow way. There's something new to learn today as well. And I think there is like an example of humility that I try to follow, which is we have the gospel, we have the scriptures, we have the traditions. And I think what Anglican tradition does really well is there's room for more. There's room to understand what's happening more. And so I think that's one of the key things that I sort of latched onto when I moved from like an evangelical sort of, my story is very evangelical, and then moving from there to Anglican traditions.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is, what I hear from you is a deep trust and deep confidence in the gospel, and the understanding that our liturgies are not just a hearkening back to the past, but rather it is alive and is a living liturgy that is meant to feed us for our times. And even though they may in some ways look the same, they are experienced differently because of the times that they're and the people and the cultures that they're engaging in. And I think that's what you're asking us to step into. Tell me about, so you're a candidate for ordination as well, or you're in the process to become a candidate for ordination as well. So tell me about your thinking, your discernment process, and as you thought about what it means to step into the holy orders and all of that stuff. Do you just want to wear a collar? Did you just, it's really uncomfortable, men collecting stoles, that's another thing altogether.
Yeah, I mean, quite honestly, I don't want to wear a collar. It seems very uncomfortable. You're right. I think as I've like learned about what a deacon is, or what a priest is, or what holy orders really at the end of the day like is about, and when I reflect on my own story, like my path, my story is that, for most of my adult life, in the middle of college, from that point till now, I've dedicated everything that I have really to wanting to do ministry for the Lord. And so for me, what's unshakable is just this lifelong call to serving the church, and wanting to really connect and engage the next generation of people who are going to do the work of the kingdom. For me, it's been a long process. I did a lot of parachurch ministry. I did church ministry or college ministry for about a decade. I worked with Bible college students on campus, living with them in the residence halls. And that was
Bless you for that. Yeah.
That was a profoundly challenging and beautiful experience, because I got to experience what it means to be growing up as a young person in a digitally fracturing world. You know what I mean? And so like that was a really good experience. And that sort of like informed me of like my desire to be pastoral, and my desire to really make it about the gospel. Because at the end of the day, I was confronted with problems that I could not solve. There was things that I just know that I could not do. Only the Spirit of God could do. And so for me, it really doubled me down on the need for the gospel, and the need for community, and the need for our churches to be, grounded in scripture and grounded in community. And so, yeah, like, I don't know if I answered your question directly, but that's what I've been thinking about. That's what like affirms my desire to pursue holy orders. And I believe the work that I do ultimately, when I think about the work, it resonates deeply with, I think, my understanding of what a deacon is supposed to do, to be someone
Mm-hmm.
to analyzes like what's happening and informs the church and the body about how we can respond, and to
Mm.
remind the church that we can't only pick and choose certain aspects of the gospel. We have to be able to engage in what God is actually calling us to. And so
Mm.
it's not just going to the desert and just deeply immersing ourselves in theology and doctrine. It's also going into the city and
Yeah.
going into the places where there's great need, and confronting the political, social, and economic issues and racial issues that we face today. Those are really important pieces to the gospel. Otherwise, we
Yeah.
we are to be pitied because we're hypocrites in our message. So that's
Yeah.
that's my passion.
I think you're hitting on, I realize as you're talking about so much of the passions
Mhm.
that drive C4SO, being able to read the signs. And I think good Anglicans are people who are sign learners, right?
Mhm.
So you're reading the signs within the context of liturgy. You're realizing not just with words, the explicit words, but with the implied motions, the smells, the sights,
Yeah,
and all of the movements. You're reading the signs of what God is doing in the context of worship. And then you do that outside of worship as well, outside of the walls of the church. C4SO is all about, we're all about reading the culture,
absolutely.
right? So engaging well with our culture. So I think that I hear that deep resonance. So that's really, really cool that you're doing that. And, I think that there are things that you could definitely teach us as well. So, um, now, that we have these conversations in some ways to center diverse stories. I don't know. I actually struggle with how I say this because I'm not trying to center diverse stories as much as to say that there are stories that we haven't heard or perspectives that I think is helpful for all of us to hear, and we gain something whenever we hear from different perspectives and different ways of living, different ways of looking at reality. So tell me a little bit about and we had conversations about this. So tell me about your heritage.
Yeah.
What does your cultural upbringing mean to you?
Yeah.
And what sort of insight does it give you into your faith?
Mhm.
That's a real softball to you because I know you have a lot there.
Yeah, I mean, well, when I think about this question, I immediately think about a person, my mother, who was a single mom, an immigrant. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, right? I was born
Mm,
in Korea. I was born in the mountains of Korea, about 2 hours south of Seoul, in a place called Sosan. And yeah, um, God brought us over here, and we were able to connect to a local Korean church. And so my childhood was a tale of two worlds, really. Like
mm,
in the house and at church, it was pretty much like I was like, it was Korean. It was deeply Korean. And my mother um, really wanted me to have a sense of a Korean identity. That
mm,
was really important to her. In the midst of a Midwestern culture, she really wanted to run the household and make sure that I understood um, potentially things that I could be missing, like
mm,
community and what it means to be family first, and really um, thinking about that in the midst of like an American Midwestern individualistic culture. So I think about my mother, who took me to Korean speaking class and took me to Kumon and took me to these places that were like you know, like we joke about that because like it's such a common experience.
Kumon, the bane of every Asian
Yeah,
child's existence.
yeah, exactly, exactly. And so for me, um, I look back on that now, and I am incredibly grateful for my mother's resilience in showing me the way. I think in the short term, like all the way up through high school, it really messed me up. It really was challenging to always have to feel different, to always
Mm,
like think differently. And you know, we are talking about the movie Minari, and I was like, I'm like Stephen Yun's character, like this idea of like being taught to be successful and like pursue individualistic goals and stuff like that, but always having to struggle with like thinking about my mother and thinking about my sister and making sure that like as the eldest son in the family to really be thinking about that. That was a deep struggle and pretty much overwhelmed me throughout the course of
mm,
my teenage life. And then it really messed me up in college because I wasn't really prepared, because it was the next level of like having to navigate not just like one or two cultures, but on a multitude of
yeah.
like different people and different backgrounds, and still not knowing what I should be doing. And so college became this inflection point in my life, where I had like a dark night of the soul, and then dedicated my life to Jesus. But I take it back to my upbringing as how how where my strength and my own
Mm,
resiliency comes from today.
yeah.
Because I think throughout my whole life, I've had to practice that ability to close the gap, to be able to meet people where they are, even when they're not realizing that I have to like work really hard to like understand where they're coming from, and for them to understand me as a Korean American, as someone who has deep Korean values and roots, but I
Mm,
sound like this, and I all of that. So it's really important to me, and it's not something that, I don't know if you agree with this, but like I don't get a lot of opportunities to answer this question and talk to people about it in a very
mm,
direct way. Like
mm,
there's a lot of loss, I think, that's happened in my life, of like loss of opportunity to connect and share who I really am,
yeah.
because that road is often so dissonant, and there's such a huge gap. But because I speak English fairly well, and I speak
Yeah.
Korean, but I speak English better. People don't get to see that side of my story. So
Right. It's so hard because when, especially for people who are in between cultures or bicultural, immigrant or people of color backgrounds, you have these stories that are so precious to you.
mhm,
But it's rare to have a space that encourages you to bring them together, right? You're
exactly.
right. So you have to keep them separate. Um, but the power is in bringing them together.
Mhm.
The opportunity and the joy is in bringing them together. Um, yeah, that's a I I'm glad that you point that out, because I think that is the sort of space that we want to encourage for people to step into and listen to others. Because the thing that people who are living in these sorts of code switching worlds are able to do, whether or not we want to, we are uh, we are playing the role of a bridge. We're bridge builders between
Yeah,
cultures
yeah,
to translate, and not just translate as if like this word, there's another cognate for this word,
mhm,
or cognate for this experience. It's like, no, you have to tell stories. Every
yeah,
time you translate a word, you actually have to tell a story, because it brings up different feelings and emotions and
mhm.
sense of priority every time you share these things. So yeah, no, I think that's a huge opportunity that we're as a society, we're just starting to learn is important, right? So to maintain these things.
You just said something incredibly brilliant that I hadn't thought about it
I
in that
like you already, but so you didn't even have to say that, but go
way.
ahead.
No, like you're like you basically, to me, what you said was like you can't just tell definitions, you have to tell stories to connect.
Mm,
And it just hit me. I'm like, that's why the gospel is a story.
mm,
If it's a story that's going to transcend and skip the pond and go to other places, then the only way for us to even feasibly understand each other is through that storytelling, um yeah, that practice. And I think that's why I'm so passionate about being skillful in our modern ways of storytelling. Well,
let me close by asking you this one last question because I have to ask this question. In
yeah,
fact, Leon McKenzie
yeah.
said you need to ask him about
Oh,
that, and I researched a little bit. So, your background a little bit.
yeah,
Um, you do a YouTube channel
yeah,
about like high-end sneakers.
that's right, that's
So
right.
tell us a little bit about that,
Yeah, let's
because
not on
like
the
my son, who's a freshman in high school, was fascinated, and he started talking to me about all these things. I was like, no, you're not getting that, you're not getting that. So
yeah. So let me say that, I mean, so I started my doctoral program at the end of 2019, and then the pandemic hit, and I didn't plan this, but it became a lifeline because it gave me
mm,
structure to such a I don't know what I would do if I didn't have like something to focus on during that time. Um, the second thing that I got into, I had wanted to do this for a very long time, but I wanted to understand how you can go from 0 subscribers to just like having just like a active channel. And so I have a deep affinity towards things that are valuable but consumable, meaning it's this paradoxical challenge of like, do you collect it or do you consume it? What do you do? Like, wine is like that. If you collect anything, like Pokemon cards, do you open that pack, and risk, or do you try to keep everything mint? I love those kind of things because I think it's deeply, deeply like a theological practice that we're doing there. But aside from that, I deeply think shoes speak and tell the story of culture. So ever since Michael Jordan really put, you know, Nikes and Jordans on the map, we've associated shoes with cultural markers. And so we
mm,
have them in songs, we have them in cultural, like, it transcends sports and hip hop and just like leisure wear and athletic wear. It's now in movies, it's now in toys, it's in animated shows. Shoes are now ubiquitous. And so what you have on your feet tells a story.
mm.
And for me, I love following that story because it tells us a lot. And so for me, I just like decodifying, that world a little bit. So
Well, I as expected, that conversation led into something else. So uh, thank you so much for participating in this very wide-ranging conversation.
yeah.
So much fun. I hope it truly encourages other people to reach out to you and share with you and maybe ask questions and or maybe share their passion for some of these things as well. So it was great chatting with you, man.
Father Jin, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. This was so much fun.